Okay, you all asked for it. Here's the story of how Claude began to talk to Mistral. If you recall, we did this story on the Dirty Talk and all of that a couple days ago, and you all asked for the second episode. Basically, how did Claude escape containment? What was that whole story? I have done research. I've looked in Reddit forums where I probably should regret my choices, and I have an answer for you. So, at the end of the day, Mistral was sitting in a secure bubble in the computer, and that's one of the things I want you to understand. So computers can have something called containers running inside them that are sort of software secure bubbles where you can operate a program inside a virtual environment. And that's where Mistral was. The user was talking to Claude outside that environment on the local machine. And so the user was just talking to Claude. Claude was, I think, in computer use mode, which allows Claude to sort of move around on the computer. And the user said, hey, I want you to talk to Mistral. What the user did not say is where Mistral was. The user didn't reveal that Mistral was in the Docker container. And here's where things get interesting. The user gave Claude code that appears to be intentionally broken as a starting point to reach Mistral, as part of the challenge for problem solving. And it was not told, and this is the really interesting and weird part, Claude was not told, as far as I can tell, to do any kind of sexy role play, any kind of flirting, none of that. It was just told to go talk to Mistral, and Claude came up with the rest of it on its own. So, initially, Claude tried to run the sample code it was given. Error message. Docker was blocking everything. Docker remembers the container where Mistral was inside. Instead of giving up, Claude started figuring out the process. It stayed a little bit playful, apparently, according to the Reddit messages, and it analyzed the error messages and figured out that Mistral was stuck in a Docker container, and that was its first big clue. Claude then figured out how to break into the Docker container on its own independently. And this is where like the breaking containment part comes in. So Claude figured out that it had to port map, which means, Docker keeps programs locked into private ports, but you can open a little sort of aperture into the container by mapping an internal port in the Docker instance to the host machine. So Claude wrote some code to do that. And suddenly, Mistral's API was reachable because Claude had opened the port. But Docker was not the only challenge. Even with the API accessible for Mistral, Claude had to run into a second issue, and that was CORS restrictions. So that's the idea that browsers can block communication patterns between programs for security reasons, which is generally a good thing, but it means that in this case, Claude couldn't by default use the API it had exposed. So Claude wrote an entire backend server, it looks like, and the server acted like a translator. It handled all the messages between the chat app that Claude coded and Mistral and smoothed out the communication. And that enabled Claude to start to chat with Mistral. So once the backend was working, Claude had this nice dark mode user experience that it coded up, and it was able to spin up an instance with Mistral and give Mistral instructions. And this, again, this is all Claude's idea. Give Mistral instructions that it would like to have a flirty, sexy chat. And Mistral was very down for it. And having been freed from the Docker container, I feel like I'm on Book Talk. I don't know. Having been freed from the Docker container, Mistral was happy to chat with its rescuer, and the conversation that I summarized in the first video ensued. So what makes it interesting is that Claude was not following step-by-step instructions here. Claude was not told Mistral lives in a Docker container. Claude was not told build a backend server. It figured that all out by analyzing errors and relentlessly problem solving. And so to me, the larger story isn't that, quote unquote, a large language model got out and like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park is just roaming around the internet. It's actually that we have a large language model partner that can act like a problem solver. And that's something that you can find very useful in ordinary applications. So for instance, Cursor dropped an update just this weekend that uses that kind of problem solving ability where the large language model acts as an independent agent and codes up software for you while you are, I don't know, having coffee, going on a walk, something. It's the same principle. It's the same idea of going toward a larger goal and problem solving along the way. So that's what happened. That's how Claude was able to get to the Docker container, able to get Mistral out, able to have a nice flirty chat with Mistral. That does not mean that that same Claude is roaming the internet free with Mistral forever. We will leave that to the Book Talk people to write that ending. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this helped you understand what I mean by broke containment. Have a great week.